I'm Paula Ann Lopez, and this is a pitch for my project. It's coming from inside the house. Quick trigger warning, emotional abuse is briefly mentioned in this pitch. It's Coming from Inside the House is a horror anthology show with an emphasis on stories that fall into the social thriller column. It would be a Netflix original series because that's the platform that falls somewhere between HBO and the Sci Fi Channel on the production value spectrum. Each episode would be an hour long. Traditionally, anthology shows include a Rod Serling-esque host or a character like the Crypt Keeper. This show would have a female host. She wouldn't have a name, but the style would be gothic chic. I believe having a show created by a woman and hosted by a woman in a genre that isn't always empowering will attract collaborators to this project as well as draw in audiences. The pilot episode will be our focus today, and it's called That's the Keeler, which could be described to viewers like this.
When a young woman with a podcast that gives the victims of abuse a voice meets a mysterious stranger, her world is turned upside down, and she faces the consequences of exploiting others.
Our main character is Rhoda Keeler. Rhoda is a 28-year-old Chicagoan living in 2018, and she comes from an upper middle class family and grew up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. Rhoda's parents are divorced. Her father lives in the suburbs with his new wife, and her mom still lives in Rhoda's childhood home. Her father left Rhoda's mother, and Rhoda sees him as a strong, determined individual, but perceives her mom as weak. Rhoda does not see herself as a victim of her past, nor does she see her show as unethical. People are drawn to Rhoda because of her gorgeous, silky, burgundy hair, but more so her hypnotic steel gray eyes that she uses to turn any situation in her favor. Rhoda started her podcast with her producer, Jack. Her podcast is called Toxic Tales. On air, she reads emails from listeners sharing stories of their toxic relationships that involved varying degrees of abuse. Rhoda can be very charming, but she compulsively applies mascara when she feels that she's lost control of a situation and always has her mascara on her. Rhoda is generally pleased with her own independence until it is disrupted by Norman Bindrum. Norman lives in Rhoda's building and is a handsome, charming man in his early 30s. He's a sharp dresser and has gray eyes just like Rhoda's. Rhoda frequently sees him in the elevator, but she sees him as a shallow fool and assumes he is a fake and a womanizer. One day she's rushing to record her show and bumps into him in the lobby, where she reluctantly has her first proper introduction to him. This occurs on the day where Rhoda tries something new on her show. She plans to have a victim of emotional abuse confront their abuser live on air. Her guest that day is Bonnie. Bonnie is a 35-year-old woman with a faintly sloppy appearance. She wears clothes one might find in a bin and cheap, unevenly applied lipstick. Bonnie has agreed to call her ex-boyfriend on air, but she has a breakdown. Rhoda finds her crying, but convinces her the experience will be empowering. Bonnie reaches her ex by phone, and he breaks down crying, begging for her back and apologizing. Rhoda is displeased and cuts the episode short. In a moment of pure frustration, she approaches Bonnie and says, "You should have known better." Rhoda, infuriated, goes home and gets drunk. She applies her mascara in the mirror in a scene as we hear a knock at the door. It's Norman, who brought a package belonging to her up from the lobby. With her defenses down, she gives in and sleeps with Norman. Rhoda goes to work the next day, and Jack hands her a newspaper. She sees a picture of Bonnie with bold lettering directly above it that says, "Missing Woman." Between her show being derailed, letting Norman in, and Bonnie's disappearance, Rhoda starts to feel her life unravel. She finds a note from Norman asking her to meet him for dinner. She tears it up, but Rhoda's face changes as she seems determined to take control once again. She sees Norman waiting and smiles, but begins to panic and rushes into the bathroom. She notices that her eyes are baggy from the stress, so she compulsively applies mascara. She notices that her hair has a knot and she aggressively pulls it out. She returns to the table and immediately her defenses go back down as they drink wine and she becomes comfortable. Norman tells her about his job as a mentor in a re-entry program for kids that were previously in the juvenile justice system, providing them guidance. We have a sequence of shots where their romance blossoms, and then a few weeks later we find Rhoda in her apartment. She's exhausted. Her hair isn't its typical shiny self, and there are huge bags under her eyes. But she looks happy. She is looking into the mirror, getting ready for a date with Norman, when Jack calls her and asks her to check her email. She finds a link to a discussion board called the Lady Keelers. She scrolls through post after post of men and women discussing episodes of Toxic Tales and talking about how they have used it as a guide to become better liars and abusers. She notices they all reference their Norm mentor, and then there it is. A tiny picture of Norman, accompanied by dozens of posts about manipulating Rhoda and how it can be applied to any person. Rhoda cries as her mascara runs down her face and we hear a knock at the door. We cut to Bonnie on the side of the road listening to a small radio and adjusting something in the trunk of her car. She hears someone on the radio say,
Controversial podcast host Rhoda Keeler has been missing for 3 days.
As it trails off, Bonnie looks down into her trunk and we see her ex-boyfriend tied up. Bonnie used Rhoda's show to lure him in. She closes the trunk, chuckles to herself, and says, "Rhoda, you should have known better," and she drives off. This story takes place before COVID, and it will not be addressed. As Rhoda begins to unravel, there would be extreme anxiety-inducing close-ups of her eyes that look baggier over time no matter what her mood is, as though something is killing her from the inside. Close-ups convey the intense reaction Rhoda has to small moments that shatter the illusion of control, to show how deeply damaged she is and how intensely she denies it. The nameless host would start the show within the world it takes place in, and would cue the first shot with some small transitional action that gets the ball rolling, similar to Rod Serling. The general aesthetic is very bright. Rhoda's studio and her apartment are illuminated by brightness, which creates a feeling of a fake world that exists solely for the narrative, even though it mimics real-life social issues. All of Rhoda's moments of intense fear happen at night to represent the pressurized darkness inside of her. Though it is hidden, even to herself, it inevitably surfaces. There would be deep, pulsating music during the very intense scenes. The theme music would be eerie and synthy, like the intro to Tales from the Dark Side. The credit music for this episode is a cheeky song called The Cult Song by Shannon and the Clams. And that is the show. It's coming from inside the house, and the pilot episode, that's the Keeler.